The current research seeks to develop a model of parenting style that reflects the infant's age, developmental status, and disability status. The current study is the first step in development of the model. We also think that parenting style, the parenting style model that we're going to develop, has implications for the development of autism, and I'll explain that at the end. There is an interaction between child-poor early communication and parent interactional reaction. And later we'll extend this model to show that transactional development leads to autism or pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. The two samples for the data that I'm going to present consist of a group of mother-infant dyads derived from a university setting. The mothers and children were mostly Caucasian, and they ranged in age from 12 to 19 months, with a mean age of 15.65 months. The N for this group is 20. The second part of the sample is a group of mother-infant dyads in a large city in southeastern New York. Most of you know it as New York City. And this consisted of three subgroups: a Caucasian subgroup, a Chinese American immigrant subgroup, and a Hispanic American immigrant subgroup. And they ranged in age from 12 to 36 months, with a mean age of 28 months. There were 25 infants and mothers in this sample. The observations we did were video recorded play sessions. The instructions to the mothers were merely to play with your infant as you ordinarily would. We provided some toys for them, but they were free to use their own toys if they had either brought them to the university laboratory setting or whether if they used them in their homes. The first sample was done in a university laboratory consisting of a living room with comfortable furniture and toys and a child-sized table. The second sample was done in the infants' homes, and we've combined these two samples for convenience in this analysis. The time of the sessions ranged from 15 to 30 minutes, and for the group that was done in the university setting, we also administered the Bailey Infant Scales of Development, third edition. I'll present some of those results later also. The videos were coded by two male students, one graduate student, one undergraduate student. We got reasonably good reliability on most of the behaviors. The coding scheme that we use, which I'll show you in a second, preserved sequence and duration of behaviors. It's a behavioral coding system. Following the behavioral coding, we formed interactional variables using sequential analyses built into the program that we were using, the Observer. The behaviors are coded as they occur using the Observer and video presented. We use a signal detection method, have a pattern of behavioral codes, and when the pattern of the mother-infant state of behavior changes, the observer enters a new state. And so that's how the sequence and duration are preserved. The program teases that out and gives us duration, frequency, and we're also able to do sequential analysis. And finally, the behaviors are combined according to a pre-existing behavioral scheme, and I'll show you the behaviors, the maternal variables. For this analysis, we are only talking about maternal variables, and we're talking about maternal style. So these are the observation codes. It's broken down so you can see that on the left-hand side there are facial communication codes, and on the right side there are additional codes depending on the activity. So every time something changes, the observer enters a new code using one of these combinations. The observer sequences the mother and infant, and we don't have two different observers observing each. The parent interaction variables derived from the behaviors. I'm not going to show you the behaviors, I'm only going to show you some of the results of the some analysis that we've done with these. There are a number of different levels, and as I mentioned earlier, from the Yarrow et al. Study, they pointed out that there was a change as babies got older from sensory stimulation at younger ages to attention focusing at about a year. But we looked at all of these, and we don't report arousal activity level here. We will report some results using the other variables. So you see that there are three types of maternal variables that we're looking at: arousal, didactic, and social interaction. We did a cluster analysis using an SBSS cluster program, and we looked at 3, 4, and 5 cluster solutions, and we used the basic k-means clustering algorithm. A 3 cluster model was chosen over the 4 and 5 cluster models because it yielded the most distinct and definable clustering groups. 4 and 5 cluster models yielded several seemingly redundant clusters where differences in cluster means didn't seem to appreciable enough to categorize differently from the ones that we chose. However, the 3 cluster model did yield distinct groups and were significantly different from each other. We also used Ward's method for selecting clusters. We named the clusters based on loadings of the variables. So what went into the clusters were the maternal variables that I showed you a few seconds ago. Each of the 3 resultant cluster groups was significantly defined only in accordance with the 3 variables of attention focusing, teaching, and contingent stimulation. Although other variables such as sensory stimulation, parent activity, and maternal vocal responsiveness were also utilized, analysis of variances revealed that those variables accounted for no significant difference between the clusters. This is what the clusters look like, and what you can see in this slide is 3 clusters. The clusters are actually the vertical relationship of all the variables, and it's a little hard perhaps to read what each of the lines is, but the green line is attention focusing, the purple line is sensory stimulation, is teaching, the one with the X's is parent activity, and contingent stimulation and maternal vocal responsiveness are on the bottom. They're difficult to see because of the scale and the percent of occurrence. The bottom ones are ratios, the top ones are units per minute. So we've also teased out the ones at the bottom, and I'll show those to you in a minute. But what we found was that the clusters, the 3 clusters, had different combinations, and the first cluster was mostly attention focusing with a lower level of teaching and much lower levels of the other behaviors, although they existed in the cluster. The second one was high on both teaching and attention focusing. And the third one was low on attention focusing and teaching, but as you'll see in a second, it was high on maternal vocal responsiveness and contingent stimulation. So in this view of the clusters, you seem to have contingent stimulation seem to have relatively moderate, low, and higher levels in clusters 1, 2, and 3, respectively. We were also interested in whether there were differences among the 3 ethnic groups represented in our sample. And we found that cluster 1 included all 3 ethnic groups, with the largest proportion being from the Caucasian ethnic group. Cluster 2 seemed to be equally represented by all three ethnic groups, and Cluster 3 only included Caucasian and Asian parents, with the largest proportion represented by Caucasian parents. There were no Hispanic parents who utilized this style at all. Another way of showing the differences among the ethnic groups is by calculating the proportion of each cluster in the three ethnic groups. And in this table, you can see similarly that the Caucasian parents have higher representation in the attention-focusing and responsive styles. Hispanic parents are more represented in the attention-focusing style, and the Asian parents are equally distributed across all three styles. In the earlier study by Yarrow and colleagues, we had found that the attention-focusing style is a lower level style, and even though these children are much older than a year in general, the Hispanic parents seem to utilize that style extensively. I mentioned earlier that we also used we administered the Bailey scales to the university sample. We wanted to see whether there were any differences among the three clusters, or however many clusters we got. But we predicted that there would be some differences for at least cognitive level based on the Bailey scales. And in this, we had controlled for ethnic group because this group was all Caucasian. Almost half the sample that we studied were administered the Bailey scales of infant and toddler development. The Bailey scales yields 5 scores for 5 different domains: cognitive, language, motor, social emotional, and general adaptive. The last 2 are based on maternal report, but the first 3 are based on testing. As you can see, those infants that were characterized with the teaching style were the lowest on these scores, and this may be signify that the parents' response to lower functioning children is to teach them. However, it's unclear whether there's any causal relationship between infant scores and maternal-infant interaction style, because we collected these data at the same time, so it's not clear whether the cause is the level of functioning of the infant, or the level of functioning of infant is just correlated with the parent's teaching style. The other domains of the Bailey scales seem to follow the results of the cognitive scale. So the responsive style seems to have the infants with the highest level of functioning, and that's significantly different from the attention-focusing group and the teaching style group. The other variables follow similarly. In conclusion, we have demonstrated that parental behaviors can be clustered to form parenting styles based on observation. Parenting styles differ for different ethnic groups, and parenting styles are related to cognitive, language, social, emotional, and adaptive behaviors, at least in the Caucasian group. We'll follow up these children when they're 4 to 5 years old to evaluate their social behavior and maybe and communication competence to see what the relationship is, or predictive relationship is, of parenting style to child outcome. In addition, in the other part of my life, I also do clinical work with infants with autism, infants and toddlers who have a diagnosis of autism or pervasive developmental disorder. And as I've been doing the mother-infant interaction style work, I've been struck by some things that are fairly obvious to me in the parents of the children that I see. And the first one is, and these are all assumptions I'm making, if the infants are not wired to receive communication, that is, infants who eventually are diagnosed with autism or pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, and the mothers fail to get feedback from the infant, they may not respond contingently to communication efforts of the infants. The infants aren't reinforced for communication efforts, and the parents then don't reinforce the infants for their communication efforts. If the infants don't learn to communicate, therefore aren't attached and don't make eye contact, it's conceivable that the infants don't have social behaviors, communicative behaviors, and instead substitute repetitive behaviors for communication efforts. We will be testing some of these assumptions in infants and toddlers who've been diagnosed by studying parent-infant interaction among these children using our data analytical approach. And perhaps we can answer some of these questions and see if my assumptions are right. Thank you.